Why did 5.8? No, okay, whatever.
To my knowledge, anyway, when I pulled it up from the site, but the site could be wrong. But I believe it's March 6th this
You're
week.
correct. Sorry.
It's like $25 for a ticket. It's online, even if you can't actually partake in the conference while it's happening on the 6th. As long as you pay the $25 for a ticket, all the videos and everything will be available online. So you can always go back and watch later. And their tagline is, and I'm assuming they did some sort of vetting, but all the talks that you'll be hearing at Laracon online are not just repeats of ones from previous Laracons or previous Laracon onlines. They're all brand new talks. So could be a good or bad thing on that side of things, but if anything, it'll be all new information you'll be hearing for the first time or getting a refresher on it. $25. Check it out. We've got Longhorn PHP that is always ever approaching, still May 2nd to the 4th. Early bird tickets are on sale until next Wednesday, I believe.
Yeah, it's the last day for early bird tickets is the 15th.
So,
whatever that is.
Yeah, whenever the 15th is, this month is your last day to get tickets at early bird pricing before they switch to full pricing. So if you want to get those tickets a little bit cheaper, I believe it's $300 for conference and tutorial.
It's $325 for both, and then the price will go up by $50 once early bird is done.
So this is the cheapest you're going to get the tickets before we switch to full price leading into the conference. So buy them now. You're here in Austin, you don't have to worry about a hotel or any of that. You just gotta pay the cost of the conference and come hang out. I know myself and Ian and Daniel and all the other organizers can't wait to see you all there. So check it out. We'll have more information, and we've revealed the schedule already. We've started doing some speaker highlights for all the various speakers we have coming that are being tweeted out by our @LonghornPHP account, or you can even see them if you're already in the Slack. That's through austinphpchat.com, I think is where you can get to for access. If you're already part of that Slack organization, there's a Longhorn channel, and you'll be able to get all the news that we tweet out and everything all in Slack. So you can chat with all of us, get Longhorn stuff, start talking with speakers from Longhorn PHP, as we've already started loading them into Slack so that we can start coordinating with them. It's going to be an awesome time. And last thing I wanted to revisit on the calendar stuff. If you were here in January, you saw this.
What's the Slack address?
It's austinphpchat.com. If you were here in January, you saw this calendar once before, but I wanted to bring it back up because for those of you that are unaware, this year we're aiming to kind of base our talks off of 4 mega topics. So the past 2 months and tonight being our last, have been all on framework internals. Starting April through June, we'll be all of our talks are going to be more front-end focused. They won't be, there's a chance, obviously since it's a Laravel meetup, it'll be like a mix of front-end and how it ties into like Laravel itself. So you will potentially see a mix of front-end PHP, but wouldn't be surprised if there's also very front-end JavaScript or CSS or something of that realm focused talks starting April through June. July to September, we'll be touching on database, and October to December, we'll be touching on more testing-related topics. Until, like, basically through the end of the month, there's a chance that this schedule slightly changes, depending on getting guest speakers and what works in their schedules. If I've got someone for database or testing that can't meet in the months I've kind of got in my head right now, but they can present in the earlier ones, this is going to get all reorganized so that it works. So there's a chance that April won't actually start front-end topics. It could be database or testing, but once we get closer to that time frame, I'll start doing all the social media and updating through meetup.com to let y'all know what next mega topic we're loading into. But for right now, plan for the next 3 months of talks to be front end focused. Any other conferences, Ian, that I missed?
Yeah, we've got Midwest this weekend. We got Longhorn. We got PHP Tech in late May, and the CFP for Cascadia PHP is open until mid-April, and that's like late September. So that's about it.
I need to submit to a CFP. It's been a long time since I've submitted to a CFP. But that's all the fun stuff I have for y'all tonight. And as a further change of pace, it is not me presenting tonight. So now I will introduce you to tonight's speaker, Ian Lippman.
I got it. In May, it looks like the Longhorn PHP is May 2nd to 4th.
Yep.
At the same time as this meeting.
It is not the same time. It is the same dates.
Same day.
We're thinking we may
Maybe grab a speaker from there.
More likely have the conference actually on site.
Yeah, so I gotta update the meetup and everything, but at the moment the game plan is instead of this meetup happening here at Capital Factory on that day, it'll actually happen at the conference location so that both people in town for the conference and people that are here can check it out.
I can't help but be curious. Does that mean that like people without ticket? Does that mean you need a Longhorn PHP ticket to get to the meetup? Or
No.
It's way after conference hours as it is.
Yes.
Like, it's still going to be at the usual 7 to 9
Okay.
like time frame.
Okay.
So tutorial day, because I believe that's the tutorial day.
That is the tutorial
It
day,
will be
and yeah, you'll
What's the venue?
Common Historic Center up near the domain.
Basically like part of the JV pickle stuff. So, but if you are attending the conference, you could get there a little early before the meetup and then get your badge and everything checked in so you can be ready to go. Or if you're going to tutorial day, you'll already be there and you just learn more stuff just about Laravel.
More stuff.
That's
Things in the smooth side pizza yet.
to figure out what is setting here.
You need to press the HDMI button on the wall too.
Yeah.
I didn't even recognize you from the picture, Ian. I heard you at Warecraft.
Yep.
What did like the store say pizza about?
Hmm?
Did you call the store about pizza? Or what did they say?
Pizza's a lie.
Eric texted me at 7:16. He said he called them. They said the driver is leaving, hopefully like 10 minutes. So it looks like they were just running the line. I'll go back.
Did he,
No, no, you can say
did
that.
I take the phone number for him? So he can call you directly?
No, but I'll go back.
Now I just need to, why is HDMI?
Looks like it's on HDMI 2.
Yeah, it's just HDMI.
It's recognizing the thing. I don't know if there's things that they do.
Come on, characters. Cooperate.
Absolute worst case here, we can present off of somebody else's machine because if your web's from that.
I know mine.
exactly that. Why is it?
I know your stuff has worked before.
Yeah, it has. It was a different room, but this is odd. Okay. What we'll do is get that URL right there. Okay. And then tack on a /live.
Yeah, it's got going.
Okay. All right. Let me. Perfect. All right.
Is there a way for us to screen
Yes, I can. We will have to swap over to your machine at some point because I will be hopping into some code. But we'll start off here.
Can this be made full screen?
Yes, you can. Just use the Chrome full screen thingy.
Are you looking for the Laravel meetup? No, the media meetup isn't here. Maybe it's on the 16th floor. This is the Laravel
I
meetup.
think I has full screen is all go.
If you go to the view menu, there should be another like full screen check mark box thingy. View.
Yeah. It considers me.
If I just go back to it. It's like hide controls and full screen. There we go. Okay. Now,
I'm gonna watch pizza.
yeah, I will have to grab Hunter's machine in a few minutes because we're going to do the code sample stuff. But we'll deal with that in a minute. All right, so I'm in Lippman, there's Twitter. And if you want to follow along with this, there are a ton of links in this presentation so that it might actually be useful after I give it. And those are any of the highlighted stuff. So I would encourage you to pull down the presentation. Right now it's going to link to the live version so you're following along with me. But I will revise the link later on so that it goes to the just the standard version of the presentation. So I don't like facades. They're anti-patterns, and then they, despite what the documentation says, you have to do a whole lot of workarounds to make facade-based code testable. Fortunately, the container doesn't actually do anything with facades, so that level 70 voodoo about, oh yeah, do facade / whatever your class is, and it will make it available due to autoloader magic. I don't have to talk about that because that is not involved in the container. So if you were looking for a facade talk, I'm sorry, I'm going to let you down. If you want the 2.5 screens of docs, this is a link to that. But we're going to actually dive into the internals of the container. Now, the Eliminate container is available as a subtree split on GitHub. All the PR links and stuff in the commits are broken because it's a subtree split, but you can actually pull down the container on its own and use it in a project. It requires the Eliminate contracts and support and maybe a couple other things, but I believe contracts and support are the only libraries that it depends on. So you can use it on its own if you really want to, and it does support the PSR 11 standard. It actually supports it better in more recent versions, but that's your at Laravel Meetup, you're probably going to use the Laravel container in the Laravel framework. Anyway, so first off, we're going to look at, and I'm just going to kind of go through the various methods in the container class because, well, there are a fair number of them, and it's kind of useful to see what they do. Once we get to a point where we see, okay, here are various methods in kind of what they do on the surface, then we'll actually dive into, all right, how exactly does a container resolve a thing? How does a container resolve a closure? How does a container resolve a callable? In which case we'll actually get into the code. But to start off, we have this bind method. So under normal set of circumstances, the Laravel container will use the PHP's reflection API in order to figure out class names and kind of build its own tree of how to resolve an object without actually you sitting down and saying, oh, well, I need to wire this one class to take these 5 others. It will look at your type hints on your class names, which means you need to actually type in class names in order to resolve those dependencies. The only time that you would need to configure the container specifically is if you have either interfaces that you're type hinting against, in which case you need to link an interface to a concrete version of the class, or if you are if you're working with say some configuration of some sort to where you need to provide string values for some of your arguments, or if you don't trust the Laravel runtime and want to build out all your function callables for binding all your things manually. Oh wait, yeah, I fit into that category. With all that said, you've got this bind method. The first parameter of that bind method is always going to be the abstract class that you want to associate with. And then your second parameter is either a concrete version of that class. So for example, the interface is going to be the first part, the implementation of the interface is going to be the second. Or as the second parameter, you may have a closure that returns an instance of your class, similar to some of your smaller dependency injection containers out there. Now that closure will actually give you, in the context of a Laravel application, as a parameter, the entire Laravel app, which you can then turn around and pull dependencies out of to say, okay, well, my service A requires dependencies B, C, D, and E. You're usually going to be doing this in a service provider class in the register method usually. Either that being the app service provider or in a custom service provider that you've added to try and segregate some of your classes and some of your configuration from the main application. So bind under a normal set of circumstances is going to give you a new instance of the class every time you ask the container for that instance. If you want the container to give you the same instance of the class every single time, you want to use singleton, or use the third parameter in bind and set that to true rather than false. False is the default. Again, it's going to give you a new instance every single time if you don't provide any parameters. One interesting thing here is if you call bind and set your second parameter to null, then you can actually get at that third parameter if you need it. And it'll just say, okay, bind the class, the name of the abstract class to the implementation, same class all the way across. So all you're doing there is saying, hey, Laravel, for this particular class, I know you know how to resolve it already, but I want you to resolve to the same exact class every single time, rather than creating the same exact instance every time, rather than creating a new instance each time. So, as mentioned on the slides, you've got this bind if method, which will only bind a new dependency if there is not already an alias or such for it. Now, this is in contrast to the standard bind method, which it will rebind, if you say, okay, bind A to B, and then, well, I'll actually bind A to C, it will rebind and actually call the rebound event when that binding process is complete. So you've got those kind of methods, and those are usually what you'll use. That said, if you want to treat the container like an array, or if you want to treat the container like, if you want to use magic setters, then you can also use that. And if you hand it, okay, let's beat that. If you hand it a closure, then it'll just use that closure. So, okay, here's the function that I'm using to resolve this. Alternately, if you just hand it a class instance or something like that, then it will immediately wrap that instance in a closure to use to resolve. So one interesting thing that the container allows is, since it's doing a heavy amount of reflection and it's kind of having the idea of, if you need an instance of a given type of class, then you're going to need that instance across the board, and that's not necessarily true. They have the ability to do what they call contextual binding. More on that in the link there, but the idea of contextual binding is that you can say, for this particular class, for this particular object, instead of giving me the default that you would normally resolve, instead, when I ask for this class and it needs this particular dependency, then provide me this alternative. Now that actually also works with non-type dependent parameters, where you can actually say, when this particular class needs $variable, and this is via constructor injection, then provide, for example, a string for a configuration or something like that. So you've got some flexibility, some magic, which we'll get into when we actually look at the resolve method. So it'll actually give you some level of flexibility. So it's like, well, I need a certain S3 client for this bucket, I need a different S3 client for this other bucket over here. That's completely doable in the Laravel container without having to switch over to defining resolver functions. You can just say, hey, when this particular class needs this other dependency, then give me this different dependency. So now, if you already have a dependency built out and you need to throw that into the container, that's where the instance method comes in. Where it's like, okay, resolve this particular alias over to this instance of an object that I've already created, and if you need to, you can clear that association out with the forget instance method, and you can also use forget instances to clear everything out. We will take a break after I get through the 2 more slides so that we can get pizza before it goes cold. Maybe I'll be able to get my laptop to hook up to the projector at that point. So we've got another bunch of functionality in this kind of class binding side of things. You've got, you can actually check to see whether classes are bound already, or whether they've been resolved by actually pulling them back out of the dependency injection container. And you've got, in the container, it can tell the difference between something that is an instance that's already been built out versus something that's merely been bound versus something that it's going to try to use reflection to figure out what's going on. And that bound check is what is used if you are using it like a PSR11 container where you're just using the get or has methods. So the concept of tags is kind of interesting, because what you can do is say, all right, these particular classes, these particular dependencies, go ahead and tag them with some string. And then you can ask back from the container, hey, give me all of the classes that are tagged with the string. Give me all the dependencies that are tagged. And it will give you something that's iterable that you can just for each over and say, okay, here are, for example, my list of email providers or something like that. And historically that was an array, but as of Laravel 5.8, that's actually built iteratively using a generator, so that way you're not using all your memory and all your CPU to instantiate all your dependencies, even though you only need the first one. And aliases, this one is not in the documentation probably because the bind method where you can actually say bind an interface to a concretion does allow the same thing, but you also have this ability to say, well, here's an alias over here, and that alias resolves back to a given dependency that's already in the container. Finally, for the binding methods here, the extend method allows you to wrap a dependency in a closure that says, okay, take this dependency, but before you hand it back, before you call the make method and hand it back to whoever needs it, give me that dependency, and oh, by the way, I also need access to the container, and now wrap that in some sort of decorator or something like that, so you can actually add some configuration onto the dependency, maybe do some setter injection or something like that, and call a set method on there before returning that out. So, and you can actually stack multiple extends on top of each other so that you say, all right, I need one thing added and then another on this specific dependency. And you can also clear those out. And if you need to, you can not only rebind a dependency, but you can also call the rebinding method, which will say, hey, let me know when a dependency switches from one way of binding to another. And you can see there what arguments you get back in. Basically, okay, here's the new, let's see here. Here is the actual instance that's being rebound, and here's the container as well. So, and interestingly enough, the refresh method actually takes that rebind event setter and says, okay, instead of having a whole bunch of like declaring a function to do this, you can actually say, well, call this method on this class with the instance that's being rebound, and it's just kind of a convenience thing where under the hood you can replicate that exact same behavior with a closure and a couple of use statements directly on the rebinding method. And if you need to clear out the container, either a single dependency or the entire thing, then you can call unset with the array notation on the container, or you can call flush to clear everything out. So we'll break for pizza for just a second, and then we'll get into, okay, I've explained how to set dependencies in the container. How do you actually get them back out? So let's break for maybe 5 minutes to allow people to get pizza, and then we'll start back up.
There's so much pizza. Sausage, macaroni, onion, and this is maybe the
I think that is still you. It apparently eats actually projecting from HDMI. Actually have a different adapter with you.
I got mine too, that you can try.
Yeah.
It's using some of that to find over convenience that you can use when you do like your typing controller. And say like, I can play this, whatever, and things do that way. It's the really thing about the reflection class.
Yeah.
It's looking through all that and the source of people grab that kind of to make sure it's provided for that controller.
Okay.
Yeah.
You disconnect from AirPlay because it's like I think it's trying to basically take
Most of
over.
the time we don't have to do context streaming and stuff like that. But that's a little easier.
And
Suddenly, all the pizzas now, except for I got cheese.
this is interesting.
Starting to stack something pizza. Something left over.
Do you ever ranch your stuff? I explained that to him. He said, "That's what it's just." You don't even know. You don't even know. I said, "I'm ordering a cheese pizza."
That's very nice.
What's happening?
There we go.
Was there not out?
Daniel's going to steal some.
We're going to mirror. This is Pop OS, so it's System 76's spin of Ubuntu.
Wow.
And let's drop the resolution. This is why I have multiple USB-C adapters.
Oh.
Okay. Now that I'm on my own computer. Okay. So we'll start back in here. So we now have gone over how to bind dependencies and say, okay, if I ask for this, then give me this other thing. Let's go into actually resolving those dependencies and getting the information back out. So at the core of everything, we have this make method. And make, you provide as the first parameter the name of the class or interface or alias. And for the second parameter, you can provide an array of overrides that's like, hey, I know I told you to configure the class this way, but throw in additional parameters on top of that. Now, make with has the exact same behavior to the point that it almost got deprecated for, I believe, Laravel 5.8, and then folks decided not to deprecate it for some reason, because having two methods named differently that do the same thing is just the most amazing thing ever. So offset get and your magic getter also do the same thing as make. Basically, anything that you, any way that you pull dependencies out of the container, or almost any way, it's going to be some form of make. Now,
They probably do it for back compatibility reasons.
yeah, but you're allowed to do breaking changes in an app. I mean, that's what Laravel shift is for, right?
Taylor's not afraid of that.
No, he's not. And you know, backward compatibility, Laravel doesn't do Simber, so it's fine. So you've got on top of that the factory method, which gives you the ability to say, okay, I want a closure that if I call it with no arguments, then it'll give me new instance after new instance after new instance of this particular object with all of my dependencies configured. So if you need, if you're pulling something out that's like, okay, well I have I need a new instance of, say, a ML or something. Models are not the greatest example because you have crazy eloquent magic, but if you need a bunch of new instances, all with dependencies already built in, then you can use that factory method to give you a closure that will give you new instance after new instance. One interesting thing about the get method here is it's like make, except it handles exceptions a little bit differently. And the way that it handled exceptions, I believe as of 5.7 is a little bit more conformant to how PSR 11 does its stuff. But if you want to have something that resolves dependencies in the way that PSR 7 does, then that's what the get method is for, because that's the PSR 11 container interface. So with all of that, again, it all ends up boiling down to make, and make ends up boiling down to the protected resolve method, which we will get into shortly. There's also a public build method that specifically builds a single instance of a class and doesn't have as much magic going on as resolve does. That is available to for people to call directly, but I haven't seen it used anywhere. So with all of this, you can actually assign events that happen when the container is has resolved a class, and you can call those events. Well, the order that they're called is, once the class is resolved, then first it will call global onResolve events. Then it will call events that are onResolve for a specific instance. After that, it will call the after resolve, likewise doing the global methods first, and then doing the specific to a class ones last. Now, interestingly enough, those methods don't have the ability to modify anything about the actual instance. So they are more notifications rather than a kind of standard hook. If you need something to hook around an instance that you're returning, and you actually need to modify that instance, that's what the extend method is for, that we went over earlier. So you've got, again, resolving and then after resolving as your events that you can hook into, and those all get called at roughly the same time. It's just a matter of order. It's not like resolving gets called before the dependency gets all the way constructed, and after resolving gets called. They're all the same method. So with that in mind, again, the container is heavily reflection based. So let's go ahead and look inside the resolve method and the build method as well. So for this, let's go here. And, okay, let's switch to a thing that's actually visible.
I think it might just be the light.
Yeah, if we can hit the light. Hey, look, it's actually somewhat.
Can't you just change the Sublime theme or something though?
Yeah, but that's.
Yeah, you had 3 different themes up there, give it a different ones, try them all.
No, there's only one more.
That's
All right, that'll work. Okay, so. Let's start with the resolve method here. So what this ends up doing, the signature of this is very similar to what you're looking at for the make method. The only thing different is this raise events property, which we don't really have to worry about. The only difference there is whether it calls those resolved or after resolved events. So the first thing here is, okay, if we've got an alias, if we were told, hey, give me an instance and it's actually an alias, then it resolves that alias and traverses all the way down until it actually finds something that that actually has real configuration on it rather than just a link to a link to a link. Then you'll see a lot of it in this method. Okay, do we need to actually resolve this contextually? Do we need to sub in different dependencies because we did a when this class needs this other thing, then provide something different? If we have that, then we end up getting this contextual concrete thing here, which turns around and says, okay, well, do I have contextual bindings? If so, give them to me and set those in for the kind of standard path that we're operating on here. But we will back onto that. Okay, so assuming we don't have, we're either not overriding parameters and we're also not doing a contextual build, then the next thing that we do is, okay, well, do we have, just in case, we still need to make sure that we're not doing a contextual build. If we're not, and we already have an instance that, that we passed in manually earlier with the instance method, then we just hand that back instead of going through the construction process for everything. So this with thing, now we're talking about actually in phases, building up a stack of dependencies that we need to resolve. And for each of those dependencies, basically building out the entire tree of, okay, well, we need these 5 things, each one of those needs 5 things, each one of those needs 5 things. Well, PHP is single threaded, so you build up this stack, and you keep building up the stack until such time as all your dependencies are enumerated, and then you go back down the stack and resolve them. So that's what this little with array addition is there. So this get concrete abstract, let's bump over here. And okay, we've got, again, a lot of code in here to deal with contextual binding. Ignoring that for a second, we have, okay, well, we have either the class that's just sitting there as a reference, in which case we may have to use reflection, or maybe we've actually declared that specifically of here's linking A to B. So we get down here. If we've actually got a class that we can directly build, which if we've got to a point where what the class that we're looking at is actually an instance of a concrete class rather than an interface, or if the way that we declared it, it was a closure, either one of those we know how to build. If we don't know how to build something yet, then we keep on calling resolve, calling resolve, calling resolve, until we get something that's specific enough that we can actually build it. So, hence this recursive make call here. And so at this point, we've built the dependency, and now we can say, oh, well, we have some extenders, so we need to, somebody called extend on this particular dependency. They want an instance of the dependency. They're going to decorate it and then hand another instance of the dependency back out. So we call those extenders, however many of them that we have, and they are called in the order that they were added on when in the binding stage. Now, at this point, we actually finally have a fully built out instance of the object that's been decorated by the extenders. So it's a question of, okay, well, do we have, did we specify that this instance is actually shared across the entire application, or are we building a new instance each time? If it's shared across the application, then we shove it in the instances array, which means that at this point, you can't really tell the difference between an instance of a singleton and something that was actually passed in manually via the instance method on the container. Doesn't particularly matter, but we throw that in there so that if we find out that we need to get this class later than it's already built, we don't have to go through this entire resolution process again. And lastly, we have these callbacks that I mentioned earlier, these events that are firing either on resolve or after resolve. Again, they all happen roughly at once. The only thing that is being modified between on resolve or after resolve is one happens ever so slightly before the others. There's no code that executes in between those. Once all of that is done, we finally say, okay, we've got this class resolved. We can actually mark it as resolved. And if we have a stack of classes that we are building out dependencies for, then we can say, all right, that set of parameters that we just dealt with, we can pop that off the stack and move on to the next thing. So on this resolve callbacks thing, we've got here, we fire the on resolve callback and then immediately after the after resolve callbacks. So with all of that said, let's go to the build method. So recall when I said, okay, well, this is buildable if I'm being given a closure as the binding. Well, in that case, we say, okay, this is a function, and we have these arguments to it, and we immediately fire that off, and then we're done. Closures are if you want the absolute utmost performance and you don't mind playing around with a heavier amount of configuration in your app service provider or your other service providers, then declare your dependencies to resolve to functions, and that'll give you a little bit more performance, and it's a little bit more explicit, but it requires a lot more code, and it might be brittle if you move things around. So if we don't have that closure, then this is where we actually start hitting the reflection class, where we say, okay, well, we don't already have an instance of this dependency in our system. So let's figure out exactly what we need to build this instance. So we have this reflection class for this concrete class that we can actually instantiate. It's not an interface at this point. And say, okay, well, can we actually build out this class? If not, then we throw an exception here. The return here, you jump into that and it throws an exception. So, okay, we say, all right, this is, at this point, we know that we can build this. Does it have constructor? If it doesn't have constructor, then we just new up the class and hand it back. If it does have constructor, then maybe it has parameters to that constructor. And maybe those parameters, oh, okay, in all likelihood, if it has parameters, then we need to go through and resolve those parameters. If they are dependencies, or if there may be configuration, then we have to go through and make sure that those, in turn, are built out. So we jump into resolve dependencies here. Then it's just looping over each one. And maybe it's being told, okay, that we have certain parameters that we've actually specified. Use these instead of your defaults based on reflection. And in that case, we we decide, okay, we'll use those overrides rather than the thing that Laravel would have done on its own. Once we figured out what the parameters are going to be, then we actually return those back and say, okay, we'll build this out with these parameters. Now, we've got this resolve class bit here, which, oh yeah, it just calls the make on the parameter. It's using reflection to say, okay, which class do I need, or which interface do I need? Okay, go back to the container and find me one of that class or interface. And this process may happen a ton of times if you have classes that depend on classes that depend on classes that depend on other classes. And maybe that class, maybe we don't have it in the container, maybe we can't resolve it. In which case, maybe reflection tells us, hey, there is a default for this. You don't necessarily have to resolve this particular class. Just go ahead and use the default, in which case we just use the default if we can't figure out any way better to handle it. Alternately, if we're trying to resolve a number or string, some bit of configuration that's not inside a class, then we need to figure out, okay, well, do we have this, what they call contextual concrete, where you say, okay, when this class needs a dollar, whatever the parameter name is, then we can actually reach in and say, all right, did we specify when we need $food, then provide bar, and actually resolve that out, even though we're not using reflection proper to say, okay, well, this is a class, this is another class, this is another class. So you've got that little bit in there where you can contextually bind things. If you haven't actually bound this, that dollar parameter in there, then, and you've also not type-ended it such that you can actually go in and figure out how to resolve through reflection automatically. And it's like, okay, well, do I have a default that I can fall back to? And if there's a default, then it constructs that manually using the default. And if there's no default, then it's like, well, you told me that you needed this particular parameter, but I have no way of figuring out what that parameter is. Even though I tried my hardest, I used reflection, I used the contextual configuration that you gave me of when you see this class with this particular name of parameter, and yes, this does mean that the Laravel container more or less supports named parameters, therefore your parameter name matters. Therefore, if you rename a parameter in a constructor on a Laravel thing and you don't have that type-ended, then you could cause your application to break. If you can't figure out how to resolve things either by the class and pulling those out of the container, or by a particular parameter that you said, when this needs this, then provide this, then it's going to give up and say, well, I couldn't resolve your thing.
So the unresolvable primitive is an exception?
Yeah, so if we go into here, then it builds out that exception and throws it. It's kind of interesting that in certain cases he'll do a return and then throw the exception from there, while in others it's just a call to the method. And it's like, well, this is at the end of the this is at the end of the calling method, and oh, by the way, this is going to throw an exception anyway. This is fine. I think that the reason that he uses a return and then throws in the method that it's calling is to make it really obvious that execution is ending before the method ends. So realistically, in most cases, you're not going to have to realize what's going on under the hood here. You just say, okay, well, you provide links between interfaces and implementations of those interfaces in your app service provider. Or you specify when there's this named parameter in the constructor, then provide this little bit of configuration. and it will just work. But if you're wondering how quickly these things come together, or whether at runtime you're actually paying a penalty for reflection, yeah, at runtime you're paying a penalty for reflection. So there are some other containers that actually compile this stuff in and build you out an entire dependency tree, and you can cache that when Symphony's container does that. But Laravel's does not. It's actually going through each piece and using the relatively expensive reflection call to figure out which class to build in each stage. So that's that.
I couldn't see the right-hand side of that. Okay.
Yeah, so again, this is just in the container class on the Eliminate container repo. The reason that I'm somewhat glossing over these pieces is that y'all can dig into the source on this at your own leisure, and yeah. So that is for class bindings. Now, Laravel also has the ability to take a method and bind that instead. And this actually goes right along with the call method on the container, where you can say, okay, I have this method that I want you to call. I want you to index that and let me call that later. And that method either can be specified kind of similar to a callable, where it's like, okay, this class, this method, or it can be class at method, similar to other kind of at notation for routes, etc. in the container. And when you're binding these methods, what ends up happening is the container, the instance of the class that is bound is passed into that callable first. And whatever that results to. And then the second parameter is the actual container. Again, working with these callables and method binding is a little bit rarer than working with classes overall, but there are a few people who have been rather excited with advances in the flexibility that method binding gives you.
I'm a little confused if you go back to that last screen.
Yeah.
It says instance is first param passed to the bound method. But
So
where does it show that at?
So what callBound method does is it pulls a function back out of your container and says, all right, here's my function, now what do I do with it? Well, I'm going to call that function, and the same thing that you provided at call method binding, it just passes that through, but also passes the container in as well in case.
I'm just saying, like, that call method binding and showing instance is the second parameter. Right below it, you say it is the first parameter.
Yes.
Because that's for a different function.
So
it's the second parameter.
So it is turning around and saying, okay, well, we set a method binding earlier. Now let's go ahead and call that. And the way calling user functions here, this is the first parameter, and then this is the second parameter. The $this is the container.
Oh, I got it.
So it's moving from this to that. That's just a lookup here. It is a little bit easier to figure out what's going on looking at the code, but there's also a reason that the Laravel documentation doesn't even mention method bindings at all. But it's kind of interesting to see what exactly you can do with them and what actually goes on One kind of cool thing that you can do with these, with a call method is say, hey, I have a function, and that function needs type hinted arguments. Hey, container, go ahead and wrap that function for me such that I can call that and give me a closure back. When I call that closure, then resolve all the dependencies that that closure needs. Maybe it needs an AWS S3 client or something else, and then call that method with no parameters of its own. Well, call that method with all the parameters encapsulated. So it's a little weird that you can't actually throw additional parameters in because the curried, what they call a curried closure, where it's actually loaded all your parameters in beforehand, itself doesn't have any arguments. But it allows you to have portable units of logic that you pull back out of the container and say, hey, this has a whole bunch of dependencies, resolve those for me and give me a little portable unit of logic that I can use somewhere else. So if we look here, again, you very quickly get into this other bound method call stack method, which we're going to see a whole lot of stack methods in just a second. Because apparently 1,200 or 1,250 lines in this class was just enough, so we are hopping over to a new class to add functionality. So you have this call method here, and that passes in the container so that we can actually pull dependencies back out as we need them. This function here, which you can specify either as using the at notation of class and method, or maybe it's actually a closure or what have you. You can tell it, oh, by the way, override with these additional parameters. And if I need to fall back to a method or a class, then that's where I provide it. And if it's a class method, then it's a bit quicker to figure out what's going on. So, okay, well, we split the class and methods. And if you do something silly like class at and then don't provide a method, then it fails. And then it's like, okay, well, I know what class you're trying to call. So build me a class there, then call it with that method and call it with a parameter, so you have the ability to say immediately from that call, it's like, instead of giving me a dependency and then calling a method, then just build a dependency, call the method with these parameters and give me back the result. Don't even give me the actual object, which is, I guess that's slightly more functional programming, or maybe it's not, but it's kind of an interesting way of using the container if you only need an object from the container to call one method. Now, if we aren't actually calling a class method, then things get a little more interesting, where you're now trying to figure out what the dependencies of a given method are. Maybe you're using reflection to figure that out. Maybe you are configuring things with named parameters. Maybe you're configuring things with positional parameters, but you have, the container will actually go through, and if we go into the get method dependency here. So we find, okay, call reflector, and it figures out, okay, well, is this a class method or is this a function? And this is how I believe your route callables in your controllers work, where it's like, hey, I have this function on this controller, and it asks for not only the request, but also these ancillary services, what do I do to inject those? Or alternately, your console commands where you have your handle method, here's how it figures out how those extra dependencies on that handle method are resolved. So you can actually have your services type in it in your handle method or on your request method in your controllers. You don't have to construct or inject them in those cases. That's where this magic comes in.
Why wouldn't those be considered the callable methods?
Because they, so I think, so in that case you've got, like the class callable stuff, that actually maps to like your controller at action on your route declarations. Yeah. And that ends up looping back around to the call method here. So we got call class, and that still uses static call, but it'll instantiate the class, but maybe you actually have additional pieces on that class, so it actually has to call itself again. Say, okay, guys, instantiated the class. That class had dependencies. Those constructor dependencies are good to go, but I see that this method also has additional dependencies that I need to resolve on top of that. So it's actually a two-step deal where it's like, okay, I have the class, now I need to call the method. I have the method, now I have additional pieces that method needs to do its thing. Let me figure out what those pieces are and inject them into the method, and then call the method after that. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Because we're at a relatively low level of using heavy rule function and stuff like that in here, it is a little bit more difficult to follow. Okay, that's the understatement of the week. So get method dependencies. And then we figure out, okay, is this a function or method? And we grab parameters. It's like, okay, what type of parameter is this? And so we hop into here. And we say, okay, this is, oh, hey, look, we actually have the name of the parameter, which reflection told us what the name of the parameter was. And oh, we had that in our list of parameters that we said, hey, override your function call with this. It's like, okay, well, I have it picked out. Let me grab that and throw that into the function arguments to use to call the method in just a second. If we don't have that, but we do have, and this is kind of overloading these, if the parameter name doesn't match, then the next thing that we try is the parameter type hint. And if the parameter type hint matches something that we specified in our override parameters, then we actually go in and say, okay, well, we know the solution to this as well. We were provided it explicitly by the parameters array. Go ahead and add that as parameter, no big deal. If none of those, if we have so far found nothing in the actual parameter array that we were explicitly provided, it's like, okay, well, does the parameter, is it type hinted? Can we actually do something with this? If this is type hinted, then we can just go back to the container and say, well, we need an instance of whatever the type hint is. Whether that is an interface or whether that is a concrete class. And so we can say, okay, well, that's the parameter here, we're good to go there. If that doesn't work, then we fall back to the same default value thing that we saw in the constructor earlier of like, well, do we have a default value? Because we can't resolve it any other way. If we can't resolve it any other way, then we use the default value for the parameter and go with that. So this right here, I believe, is new as of Laravel 5.6. And I was wondering why that PR landed and why everybody was excited about it, and then it's honestly taken until now to figure out, oh, well, that's because now you can use a positional parameter in your random callable method, and it will actually work and you don't have to name your parameter something super specific to get this to work. It was either that or it was one of these else if blocks that that is new as of Laravel 5.6. And we'll actually look at the PR for that in a second. So with all that, we'll go back up to a top level here, jump back out of the code. If you need to access the container at any given point, the container does implement its little singleton get instance set instance thing. So if you need a global container anywhere, and this will actually work even outside of facades, then you can totally do that. So, like I said, the container has had a few improvements between 5.6 and 5.7 and 5.8. So 5.6, go here. And we have this big long list of discussion about this. And here's actually the change that we just looked at here. So, okay, so in this case, this allows you to, in your override parameters, either specify here's the parameter name, and it's effectively named parameters in your function, and it'll resolve that way. Or you can specify the class name, and it'll resolve that way. So that's the new thing as of Laravel 5.6 in doing this method injection without having to rely on what people name their parameters. So we go back here. So bind method, similar sort of deal. Apparently in 5.6 there were a few things that landed around method injection in this case. You can actually either use something that looks like your callable array syntax of class over here and method over here versus, or either class or even an interface, and then saying, okay, well, call this, find this class, and or find something that resolves in the container to this class, and then go ahead and call that specific method on it. Now you can use array notation as well as the more Laravel-esque at notation. So, and all of these things are linked to the respective PRs that landed those changes. Again, slides will be available later. That's why I'm not pulling up each PR individually. So, on 5.7, you now have, in previous times, you could do your little when X class needs Y dependency, then provide them Z. Previously, 5.6 or lower, you could only do that one alias at a time, one interface at a time. As of 5.7, you can provide an array of, given when these four classes or when these four interfaces need this particular dependency, then provide this. You can actually define all of those at the same time. And again, this is when, as of 5.7, the PSR11 exception handling stuff got cleaned up a little bit. So 5.8 actually lands a fair amount of functionality as far as the container goes. So get closure is, I believe that's an internal function, so that probably matters a little bit less, but it's actually more consistently handling behavior. It's the fact that this is a bug fix rather than an external facing feature. And y'all can read through that PR and kind of why it's going on. As I mentioned earlier, now that tagged method, instead of building an array and then handing everything back and potentially having some expensive operations to instantiate classes, it's only going to instantiate as many as you need. That said, it is a backward-breaking change because instead of handing back an array, now you're handing back something that basically the only thing you can do on it is for each or count, because it's not even a generator. It's actually a rewindable generator, which encapsulates things, and it does implement some stuff, some interfaces, but it does limit you a little bit as to how you reach in and grab stuff. But again, you get a performance benefit, because if you have 10 classes that are tagged and you're only grabbing the first one, then you're only hitting that penalty for building that first class. Or if you are grabbing all 10, then you don't necessarily have to have all 10 of them ring at the same time. And then if you use the alias method, which again is not documented at this point, then previously, if you alias something to itself, then you wouldn't catch it until you actually pull that alias back out. Now, the container will actually check to make sure you're not shooting yourself in the foot when you actually say alias A to A. So it's just error checking a little bit earlier. And 5.8 container has a whole bunch of additional type hints and such to clean things up there. So we are long on time, so I'm not going to go into service providers. Basically, if you have your app service provider class getting way too big, you can pull things out into their own service providers, use the register method to bind dependencies, use your boot method to do additional work once the app is completely wired up, and then you can add your additional service providers in. I believe it's config/app.php. You have a big old service provider array there. You can throw your service providers there. If you want to do more advanced stuff in service providers, usually you're only going to need that if you're building a package to include in multiple applications. You can go to the package development page on the Laravel docs, and it's actually pretty well documented as to what hooks and such you can use, including how to get your service provider auto-included into the application as of, I believe, was it 5.5 or 5.6 that added auto-inclusion of service providers if they were configured properly in the package. I think it was 5.5. Okay, it's 5.5, yeah. So in that case, between the service provider documentation and the package dev documentation, that more or less covers what is actually inside that service provider class. So unlike the container where there's about 15 billion things that are undocumented, the service provider stuff is actually documented pretty well. With that, I will open it up for questions. I realize that we got a bit into the weeds on dependency resolution stuff here, but that's like, okay, here's the rest of the iceberg that you may not need to use, but if something goes horribly wrong, then at least you can understand what options that you have and why it's tracing through like that. So yeah, go ahead.
So the given this class, then provide this class seems pretty straightforward usually, but it feels like a lot of times what I want to do is be like, given this user provided value or something in the database, then give me this instead. And so what's the best way, for example, if I want to have, we have a class, different classes for different sites that we can respond to reviews through, so Facebook, Google, whatever.
Yep.
And that's all being called from the same original class, but I want it to depend on a value that's in whatever the model that I'm looking at. So what's the best way to do that?
That sounds like you want to build a factory that takes as a parameter the user and then returns something else. And so that would be, at least from what I've seen in the container, that's not something that that you would handle particularly at the base container level. You would build a factory class that's like, okay, given this, and maybe that calls back to, maybe that little resolver class actually can call back to the container. But you want to lazy load that, but it's going to end up being a something that reaches back into the container and pulls things out. But it's an extra factory class that you're using there.
Okay. And trying to avoid doing like a big like if else, if else, if else.
Yeah.
And be able to just pass it the name of the site that I want to then convert the name of the class. But
Yeah, and yeah, I would say you want to encapsulate that in a factory and have effectively an array lookup where it's keys of the array are some user attribute, and then the values are the actual lookup in Laravel, in the container itself. And with aliasing, you may be able to just have some big namespace name on user / provider / whatever your alias is, and then throw that in there and use the container kit. But I would say you still want to encapsulate that in a factory class, so you're not making calls directly from a container in your application code. Yep.
Maybe I'm completely confused here, but I got sort of the impression that like a lot of the common use cases that like this container sort of construct is being used for are sort of kind of workarounds of PHP's sort of type system or lack thereof. Does that make sense?
Please rephrase your question, because so what would you see as failings of the type system or lack thereof, such that you're calling these workarounds?
I'm not really sure exactly. So I think I might just be completely off base.
Because the reflection-based stuff actually heavily relies on typing everything you possibly can and linking interfaces to implementations, which are both hallmarks of a strongly typed system. There are workarounds with name parameters and saying, okay, well, and that's more on things where you don't have a resolved type on it, such as strings and that sort of thing, because usually people are not going to have a config object that encapsulates a string in a single config object for literally every single configuration item that they have. And as a result of that, you need to be able to inject, hey, there's some random string and it's with parameter name X or Y or Z, go ahead and inject it. And actually being able to do that in a declarative fashion rather than using a function to resolve your thing and say, hey, I'm in this function, I'm still lazy loading because this closure is only called when I need it. Now go ahead and use config this, config that, config the other thing, throw those items in. The closure-based method is what I tend to use because I come from frameworks where that's the way to do things, or I come from a dependency injection container where that's about all you get. But you can, if you don't want to have closures building out every single object, you can get around the vast majority of those cases using the conditional binding stuff.
Yeah, I didn't quite get all that just because I'm new. But yeah, it seems that my impression was kind of quite a bit off base, basically.
It's a reflection-based dependency injection container works much better when you throw types everywhere.
Oh yeah.
And well, and actually your more basic dependency injection containers that rely on you to self-wire everything work. There's less difference ease of use wise between those when you don't have type parameters everywhere because you're doing all the wiring yourself. You're not relying on automation to do it. Additional questions?
will you post these slides on Meetup?
Yes, I will. Thank you for reminding me. I will comment and I will link to that short link there. All right. Thank you all for letting me blather on.
So, we've still got a pretty decent amount of pizza and brownies up here. So, if you'd like some for the road, or you'd like to just take a whole box, please do. Just change a different day.
I think I'll just take mine.
Yes.
Oh, crap, that's what that's.
Do you know the examples of where
Yeah.
that function is used in Laravel itself, or is that just available for?
I saw what you wanted.
I'm not sure on
Yeah,
the
we-
binding guide.
Yeah.
Figure out the
We
binding.
need to line up
Where-
things,
yeah.
I'll let you know.
You call
I've got
the constructor and they
the
like,
next pyro
oh crap, I
project.
need to that's the dependency
Supposed
here.
to launch.
Yeah.
That's on the route and I'll get a letter on console dependency.
I've been handling that.
I will, yeah, I'll see what I can organize and let you know.
Yeah.
Start to think around.
Yeah,
If not, then we'll,
I think it's for wouldn't be a bad idea.
Yeah,
I mentioned launching a
Pyro site.
nice.
Fine.
Yeah. For what it
I need
is,
no way to
that's
see that's what's happening right now.
Let you know.
If
Why would you
you,
override that?
if
Get some more
you
pizza, Joe Patrick?
have
Your own young man.
a function, and that's all you need for a certain site,
No problem.
you
Thanks,
don't need
guys.
an entire class, then declare your closure, have your parameters in there, and type in them, and let the container sort it out. It's as is comparable to having a class with constructor injected parameters in your underscore code.
So it's really only useful
Did a
for that auto.
hang out some technical interview with a front end engineer. Still looking to hire, at least for right now, like 2 software engineers. Which is going. We're a bit picky, so it makes it slower to find. Yeah, I saw one last post of like, if you know those of this type and here, $10,000 referral fees. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
I need to find developers of that type of $10,000. And then you,
Well, here's the thing.
It's cheaper
Um,
than paying.
and make sure Lyle counts as a
Yeah,
gift,
it-
so that I
it's-
don't get billed my
It's
taxes.
cheaper than paying Scour.
Yeah, recruiters like, oh yeah, minimum 15%. Okay, well, you know, Jeff starts at 100 grand. Okay, that's, if you had that referral system, like, oh, 10 grand for a referral. Well, yeah, that's 5 grand less than we would have paid.
Meanwhile, we get like, it's funny because some of the other departments have referral bonuses in Modernize, but they're like $500, and then the engineer referral bonus is like $2 grand. So everyone at the company is really keen to refer engineers they know.
You want to help me just meet up outreach before you nails us about it tomorrow?
Hey guys, you should do some meetup outreach.
Yes.
Because we need
Not
to sell more
necessarily tonight,
tickets.
I gotta go home, but let's maybe chat tomorrow before the call.
Yeah, I'll see what I can do. Yeah, my schedule's pretty packed lately, but I'll see what I can do. So I'm gonna start accomplishing tomorrow.
I would,
Makes it feel any better. It's easy for me to get Laravel Austin and reach out done. So that's technically done.
Was it, did you mention it today?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I figured you would have.
it was good.
Yeah, you were on until lunch, which was actually a waste of time because I hadn't left yet.
Ridiculous. Just
How dare? But yeah, I can definitely help out. I need to also try and whip up a email to go out.
Yeah, because we're getting close to the
I'm
early
assuming-
bird ending, and we've gotten additional email subscribers, so we need to tell them, hey, buy tickets now, so we can get them to buy tickets now.
well, remember, we do send an email out whenever somebody subscribes, an auto.
Yeah, but that's like another little bit.
I actually realized, somebody pointed out recently that we hadn't updated it since last year.
Yeah, the template's way out of there. I actually noticed that initially, but I was just like, oh yeah. And then I didn't do anything about it.
I fixed it.
Um,
Are you taking that pizza?
this is actually there's cheese and one slice of sausage.
Yeah, well, I'll take it home with nobody else.
I feel like it's all yours.
The, half-hour drive or whatever it is. It'll be in a half hour now because there's no traffic there.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Those menus for you guys will add.
Jumping Springs.
Yes,
So I'm
Okay.
going to be in the
Okay,
office
thank
Mondays
you.
and
Thank you very
Tuesdays.
much.
No problem.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to drive an hour both ways every day.
I would think
45
about
minutes.
that. Yeah, that's sweet, man. What's it like down there now?
It's a great town. There's a lot of new stuff going up there.
Where do you want to go?
Dripping Springs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I love being close to hill country, so
Don't blame me.
that's why I chose that versus going up north. Really, yeah.
Are we going to take this soda ball or something?
I must not. But yeah, it's far, but we're not getting out as much as we used to anyway, so might as well.
Right.
Use
Have
some
a nice
nice
place.
and a little cheaper than here.
Would you like to bring this back up to your office?
No, but
If you don't want to,
I'll just take my backpack and bring it tomorrow.
I
Like
can
the
keep it
streets.
as part of meetup supplies.
No, let's just do that.
Okay. After this, I was gonna say, you can totally just leave it with me.
I don't think they're gonna miss it.
Paper towels, no. Not at all. Much like Marlon is probably not gonna notice the half stack of plates I gained from them.
Yeah, I stole a jar of peanut butter from Big Bush a couple weeks ago. I told our HR person, I was like, hey, this has been here since I moved in, and I need something for sandwiches at home because we forgot to buy it. So I'm feeling this.
I'm stealing this. You can't stop me.
Put up your foot.
Well, I don't actually know. I think it was exercise related. So back in December they put me in the boot, and then all of January I was in a cast, and then I'm back in the boot. And I also have a ultrasound device, which apparently ultrasound can help bones heal. So it's like a fancy thing. I'm supposed to scan my bone twice a day. I'll go back in 3 weeks or so and see if it's made any progress. But it's mainly been a bummer because I can't work out, or I could, but I don't feel like doing anything.
Yeah.
But it doesn't hurt.
Two organizers now have feet-related injuries.
So
It's not as bad as yours.
Is yours dance related?
I don't know if it's necessarily caused by it, but it didn't help it either.
Yeah, that was
I
the
think-
same with the gym for me. Is I don't know if that's what caused it, but jumping and running made it way worse.
Yeah, I think the problem is just furthering my, just absolutely garbage genetics. We've seemed to find out that my muscles just like to run tight, so what's happened is from bottom of my knee all the way through my Achilles, everything's just yanked super tight and just won't relax on either leg. Like I can't actually get to a 90-degree squat.
Oh wow.
With
Do you have like stretches to do, or?
Yeah, I've been going to physical therapy for stretches. I got it tomorrow morning actually, and basically the running theory is I have Achilles tendonitis on my left foot, which is really fun because with this cold weather, the sudden drop with the barometric pressure and all that, it's just been killing me. I'm like, cool, it's been feeling better because I've been going to physical therapy, and then it gets cold, and now I'm 80 years old, 90 degrees. I wouldn't hurt if it was 80 degrees out.
Well, thankfully it's March, so you know it's gonna be hot soon.
Yeah, but it's been fun. Walking up and down stairs is not always my favorite activity, which is unfortunate since my garage doesn't have an elevator, so I have to walk up and down stairs to get to my car.
But
Or up and then climb on the ramp, but honestly both as the foot having to do the step back up action or walking up the incline costs the same amount of pain. So it's like, nah, fuck it. Stairs are just faster.
well, good luck.
Thank you. Good luck with yours as well.
I'll see you all there.
Yep.
We'll talk to you two tomorrow.
Yep.
Oh, Eric, you don't want to have one of those organizer calls. I think we've welcomed them.
Yeah, okay.
See what.
I guess we're talking about which volunteers to fire that week.
All right, well.
Okay, that's